My name is Shane Sanders. Today I'm going to be talking about informed voting and electoral outcomes, a natural experiment from Major League Baseball MVP voting. This is joint work with Joel Potter, Justin Ehrlich, and Justin Perline. So Major League Baseball was formed in 1903 and it started as a confederacy, a very loose association between the National League and the American League. And so, as you know, that's why we have essentially two different games on the margins. We have, the DH rule, and and then a difference in how the degree to which pitchers specialize and these sorts of things. And so it remained kind of a confederacy through the 20th century. And so that's been important to the MVP award because these two leagues have maintained two separate MVPs throughout the history of MLB. Since 1911, the NL and AL have selected separate MVPs following each season. Since 1931, Baseball Writers Association of America members have selected the NL and AL MVPs respectively. And they formally began voting on this process in 1938 with three Baseball Writers members voting for each MLB city. This was reduced to two later in 1961, two per city. Today we've maintained this system of two per city. There's 60 voters, 30 for each league MVP race. Therefore, there are a total of 30 first place votes and 30 voters for 30 ballots essentially for each MVP race in a year. Each voter fills in a 10-place ballot with his or her first place vote, second place vote, all the way out to the 10th place vote. It is a write-in ballot. Players receive 14 points for each first place vote, 9 points for each second place vote, 8 points for each third place vote, and so on down to 1 point for a 10th place vote. The player with the highest point total wins. So in each league there are 59 times 30, so there's 59 points on a ballot and there are 30 ballots, so there are 1,770 total points available. And the most points a single player can receive is, well, they can get 14 points for a first place vote and they can get up to 30 first place votes, so they can get up to 420 points. Absent a cross-positional win value measure, MLB MVP votes represent an apples to oranges comparison. So as you know, baseball has cases of extreme specialization. So we have to assess value that's being contributed in very different ways and with very different frequencies. For example, how should one compare a top shortstop to a top pitcher without a cross-positional win value measure? It's very difficult to do. Firstly, the shortstop is playing every day, whereas the pitcher, the starting pitcher, is pitching maybe once every 6 days. And so the pitcher is contributing a lot of value on a weekly basis, whereas the shortstop is contributing value more gradually, but on a daily basis. It's very difficult to perceive the difference in value. Not only are they contributing value in different ways, but with different frequencies and in different magnitudes. In 2004, wins above replacement was created by baseball prospectus writer Jay Jaffe as a cross-positional measure of player win value above replacement. And so Jaffe credits Clay Davenport for earlier sabermetric work that helped him put together this notion. From 2004, WAR has been calculated for all MLB player seasons. Importantly, it has also been calculated retrospectively for the universe of preserved professional baseball. So Baseball Reference, for example, features retrospective calculations beginning with the first season of the first professional baseball league, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. existed from 1871 to 1875 and from which the National League formed, and continuing through the histories of the National League from 1876 and the American League from 1901. So this retrospective calculation should be credited to the massive crowdsourced data collection project, retrosheet.org. So the archive data from RetroSheet made this retrospective calculation possible. And of course, RetroSheet was created as a crowdsourced project by David Smith, a biology professor at the University of Delaware in 1989. And it's probably one of the first successful examples of internet crowdsourcing for data, at least that I know of. The concurrent collection of past and present war data since 2004 has created something of a natural experimental setting. Since 2004, Major League Baseball MVP award voters have voted largely in the knowledge of war values for players. Before 2004, voters were relatively uninformed, and MVP decisions involved apples to oranges comparisons across positions. So it's a really tall order before 2004. It may remain a tall order, but certainly before 2004 it was. Given war's prominence, one might speculate that baseball writers who vote for MLB MVP awards each year represent informed voters relative to their pre-2004 counterparts, who in many cases are the same voters, but now they've gained this information. Beyond frequent references to war by baseball writers, we can refer to a Google Trends time series graph of the term's search history prominence since 2004. And so we see that it has gained increasing prominence since then, but that the term's popularity is cyclical. And so we'll talk in the next slide a little bit about that cyclicality. But it's interesting that Jay Jaffe's original article came out on January 6th, 2004, and Google Trends data repository starts on January 1st, 2004. So we note that interest in war is cyclical. It builds throughout the season, typically peaking in August or September and falling off during the playoffs and into the off-season. The MLB MVP vote occurs just after the close of the MLB regular season in September, at or near the height of annual search interest in war. The present study relates to a few different literatures. I would say primarily it relates to the literature on the effects of informed voting on the quality of votes vis-a-vis instruments that objectively rate the quality of candidates. So Banerjee et al. Conduct field voting experiments. They find evidence that nonpartisan, third-party public disclosure of incumbent legislative report cards led to a higher voter share for high-performing incumbents. So this was a field experiment in India, in Mumbai, and it had significant results on changes in voting behavior. Pandey in the same year reviews the literature on informed voting and concludes the above finding to be robust across different voting environments. The present study also relates to just the use of MLB for microeconomic studies. For example, Shugart uses the MLB to understand antitrust regulation and just some of the gray areas surrounding antitrust legislation. Ross and Dunn use the MLB to understand income tax responsiveness of ultra high income people. Goff, Shugart, and Tollison study the MLB with respect to issues of moral hazard. Hill and Gruthius use the MLB in their study of the redistribution of rents among teams of a league. Namely, they study revenue sharing. And then Fort helped to start a literature on the inelastic ticket pricing puzzle. in Major League Baseball and other sports. So our research question is, do MLB MVP elections beginning in 2004 relate more strongly to an objective, comprehensive, cross-positional measure of on-field value, that is WAR? That is to say, are informed voters making choices that allow them to more closely identify the true most valuable player in each league? In the absence of WAR, what types of proxies for player value were voters using prior to 2004? And we have kind of a side question. Do elite MLB pitchers share the fate of people born the day before Christmas or the day of Christmas? So after a pitcher receives the Cy Young Award, are voters reluctant to double reward him, especially in the absence of WAR values? So are pitchers penalized in the MVP race, possibly because of the Cy Young? And did the advent of WAR change this at all for pitchers? So we've collected data on the top 50 seasonal MLB WAR leaders in each season from 1980 to 2017. So this data set consists of 1,900 player season observations scraped from baseballreference.com with permission from their CEO, Sean Foreman, using our vest package in R. Variables at the player season level include WAR value, MVP candidate vote count, and voting points, whether the player is a pitcher, primary team of play fixed effects, and whether the player has been traded during the season, also league of play. Voter level or ballot level data was not publicly disclosed for the MVP race until 2018. On the Baseball Writers website, you can get it back to 2012, but we're interested in variation before and after 2004 here, so we don't quite have a long enough panel of ballot level data to make that level of data work for this study, unfortunately. Therefore, we examine MLB MVP vote count and vote points for a player season as our main left-hand side variable. We take advantage of a long set of longitudinal data with substantial variation in player characteristics. We also take advantage of the natural experimental context of WAR's development and subsequent retrospective calculation. So we can look behind a curtain that pre-2004 voters were never able to look behind, and we can assess their performance. So a little note here. This study is not presupposing that the MVP race should just rightly become a contest of highest WAR. That would probably be anticlimactic. But it is saying that probably if before 2004 voting was not very strongly correlated with WAR, probably we would want to improve that or strengthen that correlation. And probably that should be a central factor in deciding the MVP. Maybe not the only factor, but certainly I think not the only factor, but a central factor. So that's kind of the philosophical foundation of the piece. It's not trying to reinvent the MVP race or say that it should have been reinvented. So in the data, we observed that there are 1,123 player seasons that received at least one vote of the 76 league seasons represented. There were 30 voters casting up to 10 votes per league season, and there were 76 league seasons in the data. So if all of the ballots were completely filled in, so each ballot wrote in all 10 names, then the minimum number of player seasons represented would be 760. So the maximum under the same assumption is 22,800. So the 760 would be in each of the 76 league seasons. All 30 voters for a league season race identified the same 10 players on their ballot. Okay, so there was perfect consensus across all ballots in every MVP race. That would be incredible. So we don't expect 760. What? Where do we find the maximum? Well, the maximum represents no consensus. So in each league season MVP race, you have no overlap between ballots, between the names on any two ballots. So you have 30 voters putting forth 300 names collectively. So we don't expect that either. But the fact that we have 1,123 players over that period of time of our data receiving votes means there's quite a bit of consensus. That's a lot closer to 760 than it is to 22,800. And especially given that we know that almost all votes were used, so almost all ballots are completely written in. So we conclude a high degree of consensus among voters. We also have an idea that this consensus did not always correspond to war, given things like pitcher summary statistics. For each league season, we've taken the rank correlation, the Spearman rank correlation between WAR and MVP vote points. And so each of these data points represents that correlation, that rank correlation for a league season. And so we find that, so we split the plot between pre and post 2004, and we find a growing rank correlation after 2004. The average was higher, the average rank correlation was higher, and it was growing over that time period, suggesting the possibility of war having an adoption period. Okay, before that, this rank correlation was pretty flat, and it had a lower average. So there's some visual evidence to suggest there may be a policy effect here after war was created. To test this, we specify a set of OLS and negative binomial count models. We also use Poisson count models. And each of these models has team fixed effects regressions to estimate the effect of the summarized explanatory variables upon vote count. Alternatively, we specify the same models with league fixed effects in place of team fixed effects. So here are the regression results for our OLS, negative binomial, and Poisson models, respectively. And so model 1, the OLS results, are going to make the most intuitive sense because they're just a regression of vote points against war, units of war, and then war interacted with whether the vote occurred from 2004 onward, and whether the player is a pitcher, whether they're in the American League. And so what we find is that for each additional unit of war over the data period, a player expects additional vote points, and namely 38 additional vote points, or 37.66. So that's the equivalent value of two additional first place votes and an additional second place vote out of the 30 ballots, or you can slice it up in a number of ways. But it's significant and substantial. Each unit of war gets you a large number of additional vote points if you're kind of in this running of top players. War interacted with 2004, so this tells us that actually you got 3 additional vote points for each unit of war after 2004. And then you're penalized steeply for being a pitcher. So you lose controlling for war and the time period of the vote. You lose 79 vote points for being a pitcher. Okay, so it seems like I don't know what it is. Maybe they can't do this apples to oranges comparison, or maybe a lot of voters feel like the Cy Young Award is the MVP award for pitchers, but for whatever reason, pitchers are docked, conditional on a level of WAR and the time period of the vote. They're docked 79 vote points. So in almost all years, that would be a pivotal effect. So it's very difficult, as the results suggest, very difficult for a pitcher to become MVP, as the actual vote results suggest. But this is quantifying that difficulty. There's no real significant difference between leagues. So models 2 and 3 are count models, and they correspond very well, I would say, qualitatively and quantitatively. There is something strange going on with the Poisson model. As you know, negative binomial and Poisson models have different assumptions as to variance of the left-hand side variable. But there's something strange going on between the models 2 and 3 with respect to league effects. But otherwise, they correspond pretty well. We consider the same model for pitchers only, and we find that for each unit of WAR, pitchers receive fewer vote points, fewer additional vote points. And we also find that the advent of WAR really didn't make a difference for pitchers. They're still getting docked about the same that they were before 2004. They're essentially getting the same number of additional vote points per additional unit of WAR, and it's much less additional vote points than for a position player. And there's no real difference between leagues in this respect. In a Chow test, we reject the null hypothesis that the coefficient for WAR was equal before and after 2004. We get an F statistic of 9.64. So there's very strong evidence that the pre-2004 and post-2004 periods are very different. We would like to determine endogenously when the structural breaks occurred. However, we are dealing with panel data here and not a strict time series data set. So we have repeated player season observations for each league season. So as far as I know, the Chow test is the best we can do, so we can exogenously assess whether the pre and post 2004 periods are the same or different, and we find that they're significantly different. And given that an event actually occurred in 2004, I think an exogenous test such as the Chow test is appropriate here. So WAR matters in the MVP race, and this is particularly so after 2004 for position players. The effect of WAR on MVP vote count increased after 2004. There is no evidence that this was a general time trend. If we create an interaction term capturing the effect of WAR on MVP vote count from 1994 to 2003, or for alternative periods leading up to 2004, we find that revealed WAR had no more effect on MVP voting during this intermediate period than during the earlier data period. So it's not just generally voters were getting more savvy. It seems like there actually was a break point at 2004 following the advent of WAR and its almost immediate circulation within the baseball writers community. Conditional upon WAR, pitchers are penalized by MVP voters pretty steeply, and this has occurred almost equally both before and during the era of WAR. There is preliminary evidence that being traded also is penalized by MVP voters, which is strange because on one hand, I think the player has nothing really to do with whether he is traded, but on the other hand, maybe that's picking something up that there's more to the player's value than WAR, and so by being traded, there's some sort of adverse selection signal that's suggesting something about the player's actual value. So there could be something like that, although it's not clear. Age, experience, and position of play are needed as controls in a fully specified model. So we're still getting these control variables. And so thank you, and I appreciate any comments on the work.